We start with the four great bodhisattva vows. Sentient beings are numberless. We vow to help them all. Delusions are countless. We vow to see through them all. Opportunities to awaken are infinite. We vow to embrace them all. The Buddha way is endless. We vow to embody it. And we will begin with our 15 minutes of seated meditation. We chant the Gatha on opening the sutras. This Dharma, incomparably profound and minutely subtle, is rarely encountered, even in hundreds of thousands of millions of ages. Now we see it, hear it, hold and maintain it. May we completely realize the true mind of all Buddhas. All right, so relax. Put your feet up, because it's story time this evening with our Dharma brother from the Lone Star State, Reverend Minwi Maitri.
Thank you, Venerable. Can you guys hear me okay? We're okay? All right. So I guess I'm going to start off by apologizing. I will try my best not to be long-winded. I was asked once, do you like to talk so much because you're a lawyer? I said, no, I'm a lawyer because I like to talk so much. So, you know, our personalities often lead us into our career fields of choices, and obviously the same is true for me. But tonight I want to talk a little bit and kind of do a little show and tell with you. But I want to talk a little bit about what I call the cult of Guanyin. And by cult, I don't mean that in the modern sense of some crazy guy who leads people off to wear purple tennis shoes and think they're all going to be taken away in a spaceship. I mean it in a sense of, in the Catholic Church, they have a clear cult of Mary, or they have a clear cult of Joseph, which is a sincerely held devotion to an individual. And that's what I mean when I talk about this cult of Guanyin. And I want to talk about how it developed just a little bit. So I'm not trying to play Stump the Chump, but does anyone happen to know what's in the Lotus Sutra in chapter 25? Well, probably not until I tell you, but chapter 25 of the Lotus Sutra is entirely, and it's sometimes called the Guanyin Sutra or the Avalokiteshvara Sutra. Now, the interesting part about this is the word Guanyin, or Guanxiyin, as they actually say in Chinese in the complete sense, is actually how they translate Avalokiteshvara, which, excuse my my bad Sanskrit and my bad Mandarin, but it basically means one who hears the cries of the world. Okay, or one who hears the voices of the world. And so this Guanxiyin, as was translated from the Prakrit language of, it was clearly not true Sanskrit that the Lotus Sutra was originally written in. But when it was translated, Avalokiteshvara was translated into Guanxiyin in Chinese. And most of the versions that we have of the Lotus Sutra nowadays come from the Chinese translations, not from these early Prakrit versions. So just to read you just a few lines of this. So chapter 25 is called the Universal Door of Guanxiyin Bodhisattva. And this, again, is the 25th chapter of the Lotus Sutra. At that time, inexhaustible intention Bodhisattva rose from his seat, uncovered his right shoulder, placed his palms together, and facing the Buddha said, "World-honored one, for what reason is the Bodhisattva Guanxiyin called Guanxiyin?" The Buddha told inexhaustible intention Bodhisattva, "Good man, if any of the limitless hundreds of thousands of myriads of kotis of living beings who are undergoing all kinds of suffering hear of Guanxiyin Bodhisattva and recite his name single-mindedly, Guanxiyin Bodhisattva will immediately hear their voices and rescue them." And this was the beginning of this lore or cult of Guanxiyin that began its trek through China and East Asia. And I point out to you here, when the Lotus Sutra was compiled and translated into Chinese, scientists and historians kind of differ on exactly the year. Nobody knows exactly the year that it was first translated into Chinese, but sometime in the 1st or 2nd century AD, or or CE as people like to call it nowadays. We know that the Lotus Sutra was first translated into Chinese, and this concept of Avalokiteshvara obtaining the name of Guan Shi Yin came about. But at that time, he was still recognized as a masculine figure, that masculine figure of Avalokiteshvara from the ancient days, so to speak, of India. But from that time forward, we see this Sinicization, or this Chinese making, morphing of Guan Shi Yin into what we think of as Guan Shi Yin today. And when anybody asks who's Guan Shi Yin, we all kind of have the same concept in our mind of who this is. And having lived for the past year in East Asia, believe me, this idea of Guan Shi Yin, or Guan Teom as they call her in Vietnam, is not this masculine figure of old. And it's not this androgynous figure that really doesn't have a gender. It's clearly a female form. And she plays an important role in the culture that kind of spans between Buddhism and non-Buddhism in these East Asian cultures. And that's what began to happen around the same time that Zen began to form in China. And so these are kind of co-developing phenomenon in China, that there's the Zen thread, and then there's this idea of the Guan Shi Yin that is caught up in a lot of the Tendai versions of the of early Chinese Buddhism, as well as the Pure Land versions of Chinese Buddhism that began to form. And so in about, well, it's the middle of the Tang Dynasty. So the Tang Dynasty was approximately, somebody help me out if you know better than me, it's approximately 600 AD to 1000 AD. This is about the time that Zen really began to form into its own. And we had the great Zen masters of old, including, Huang Po, for example, who was considered to be one of the teachers of Lin Ji, right? Who kind of founded the version of Zen that we follow with our koan readings and learnings and those types of things. So Huang Po was even so bold to say in some of his writings, don't follow this Pure Land version of Buddhism, because all that's going to do is trap you in a cycle of karma. Instead, follow this clear mind version of Buddhism that he was teaching of Zen, which was to alleviate your karma, not to create this cycle of karma that he more or less disparaged Pure Land Buddhism as to creating, that you would continue to create this cycle of good karma and in order to try to get rid of your bad karma, and then you could be reborn in a Pure Land where you could receive your final nirvana or final enlightenment or awakening. So Huang Po didn't really like that, and that kind of got passed on to his students, including Lin Ji, etc. But we have this concept that continued, like I said, because they developed around the same time, and Zen became initially Chan. Of course, it became this distinctly Chinese sect of Buddhism, which, as all of us know, incorporated a lot of Taoism into it. It was even our great grandfather of the Dharma, Sung San, who said basically Buddhism and Taoism got together, they got married and had a baby, and they called it Zen. And that was kind of, the creation of Zen in the East was this morphing of Buddhism and Taoism. But like I said, so along the same lines, Guan Shi Yin began with her current name, as we call her, a her nowadays, began with her current name in the Lotus Sutra, as that was translated into Chinese. And so I just want to share a couple of things with you, a little bit of it, again, as I'm going to call it my show and tell. But I'm going to start this off with just maybe 30 seconds or 40 seconds of Uh, So my guess is most of you have heard some of that before, and it's actually pretty long. It's 20 or 30-minute long recording of the monks and nuns and the Plum Village tradition, Thich Nhat Hanh's tradition, which is a Vietnamese Zen order, um, paying homage to Avalokiteshvara, which interestingly enough, they don't call Guan Yin or Guan Te Am, which is the Vietnamese word for um, this modern version. But by modern, I mean this creation where Avalokiteshvara takes on a feminine form. Um, but anyway, I want to show you now, if I can, let me go back to my sharing. So I have a little collection here, and if I can share this with you, hopefully you guys can all see it. These are pictures just of Guan Yin, Guan Te Am, in all of her different forms. And these are all from Vietnamese temples. The first two are actually from Vietnamese temples in California, but that's kind of the traditional version as we see of Guan Yin in most modern temples nowadays. This one again in California. And the rest of these now are in Vietnam. Very similar. This is on an island in the kind of the middle of the Mekong River. And there's this whole temple just to Guan Te Am, or the Chinese version Guan Shi. And then this is in Ho Chi Minh City. And so I won't spend a lot of time on these, but I want you to see how the majority of these are very feminine in form, unless you go back to something like this, which is kind of the ancient version, where you see she has all these hands and all these eyes or heads that can see everything in the world. But just in that section of town that I lived in when I was in Saigon, there were two separate temples just dedicated to Guan Yin. And they were both called the Guan Yin Temple or the Guan Am, Chua Guan Am in Vietnamese. But they all contain these giant statues. And now, interestingly, you can go into some of these temples and you might see 20 or 30, maybe more, maybe hundreds of Guan Yin statues, and only one or two statues of the Buddha, whether it be Shakyamuni Buddha or Amitabha Buddha. You will almost only see Guan Yin statues. And you see they, even on the side at the gates, they have these little various versions of Guan Yin statue that's set up where people can leave offerings. And you see she's wearing many different robes, but they're all very feminine. You see what a central role she plays here in this standing statue, and there's statues all around her of Buddha, but those are minor characters actually. And so some of these temples, Guan Yin plays, if not the dominant role, definitely a dominant role. And in some of them, she plays the dominant role. And you see in some of them, it's a little androgynous. You can't really tell if it's a male or a female. And some of them, like this one or the one before it, where she has lots of rosy cheek makeup on, it's clearly very feminine in form. And so and so I went to this museum that they had, and they had lots of different versions of statues from around the world of Guanyin or Avalokiteshvara. And this one predates the synicization of Avalokiteshvara. And so you see it's clearly a male form. So it's clearly from before the 1st or 2nd century synicization of Avalokiteshvara into Guanyin. So I'll go through these a little bit quicker. Again, it wasn't intended to be a show and tell, but I wanted to talk about what happened here and why Guanyin needed to be made into a more or less a Chinese deity. And then how does that still fit within Buddhism today? This kind of is the very feminine, real synicization of what we think of as of Guanyin today. Clearly feminine in form. This is kind of in that transitionary period where the male form of Avalokiteshvara is slowly transforming into a female form. And this happened over a few centuries in China, and of course, and in the realms of China. And so if I can go back to stop sharing these. Okay, so what happened here? Well, as Buddhism came to East Asia, it was a foreign religion. It really was, right? It came from India, and it didn't meet a lot of what the native people understood as their sensibilities of what is compassion. When we think of the Buddha, we think of him teaching compassion, but compassion was not known as a masculine trait in China. And so in order to teach compassion, they needed to place this in a way or construct a method of teaching compassion that fit to their normal cultural ideas or sensitivities. And one of those was to transform these ideas of compassion and loving kindness and the ability to listen to someone. Again, men were not known for being great listeners, right? But if somebody had a problem, who'd they go talk to? They talked to their mom or their wife or their sister. It was this compassionate motherly trait that was needed in Chinese culture in order for them to accept this bodhisattva as a teaching method or something expedient, as we might have called it in the Lotus Sutra, as an expedient method of teaching. And so slowly over the centuries that Zen began to develop, Avalokiteshvara took on this very feminine form. Took on the feminine form so much so that by the time that Christian missionaries began to arrive in southern China in the 15th and 16th centuries, they were hiring artisans in southern Fujian province of China to make statues of the Madonna and the baby Jesus. And then those same statues were then morphed just a little bit to create a Guanyin holding a baby. And because there was this concept, and you can even read it in the Lotus Sutra in chapter 25, there was this concept that if people would pray to Guanyin, that they could have a healthy baby. And in Chinese culture, that became this idea of having a healthy male baby, because it was the male child that carried on the family's name and tradition, etc. And so it became very important under this filial idea of Confucianism in China that families needed someone to bless them to have male babies. And that's what Guanyin had turned into. So I raised this to you today because I showed you these pictures from Vietnam, and I just wanted you to see them. And if you think of there was a well-known split in about 900 or 1000 AD. There was a well-known split between the north and south of Zen. In China, there was a split in China of north and south, and Zen kind of had a northern patriarch and a southern patriarch. This all happened kind of, if you remember in the Platform Sutra, and Hui Neng would tell us that he came from the south, and everybody just assumed that he was stupid and he didn't know anything because he was this poor southerner, right? And so what I'm trying to tell you is the south was basically what we call Guangzhou in the southern part of China, but that went all the way down into northern Vietnam. And so North Vietnam, that Hanoi area, all the way down to Hue, which is where Thich Nhat Hanh's original temple was from, all the way down to that central part of Vietnam was considered southern China. And so in this development of Zen, kind of in these northern schools and southern schools, very much in this Chinese influence was this part of Vietnam. And so as I lived in Vietnam, and you'd go to a temple and people prayed to Guanyin, it was true devotion, much like you see Catholics pray to the Virgin Mary, for example. And there's a lot of this similarities between this. They would call her even the Virgin of the Black Mountain, and they would have a black robed version of Guanyin on the top of the mountain, for example. And there was a lot of similarities of this crossover of the Virgin Mary and Guanyin. So I guess what I'm trying to tell you is this cult of Guanyin is alive and well in East Asia. It's alive and well in China. There are parts of China you can go to, and people do not even know that Guanyin has any sort of connection to Buddhism. And the only part of Buddhism they know is Guanyin. There are parts of Vietnam where it's very similar. Like I said, there'll be a temple, and it's under the auspices of the Buddhist temple, but the Buddha himself plays a very, very small role. And people come and pay devotion to Guanyin because they believe that she's the one that's going to protect them. She's the one that's going to bless them with riches or with children or whatever. And it's an interesting phenomenon that I just couldn't ignore, but I wanted to tie it into our development in Zen and how the Lotus Sutra still continues to play an important role in a lot of Zen organizations. And it's certainly something to read and understand, this idea of only one Dharma vehicle, not two, not three, but only one vehicle, comes from the Lotus Sutra. And those of you who have taken multiple precepts in the Zen order, such as our order, one of the things that we vow to do is not to create separate orders. I mean, not to create separate vehicles, and not to disparage vehicles, but to understand that there's one vehicle moving forward, and that all comes from the Lotus Sutra. So anyway, that's what I wanted to share with you guys tonight, was this idea that Guanyin lives strong and well. And when we, in our Zen tradition, still think of Avalokiteshvara, we still think of that person, that bodhisattva, in the way that we chant. We're going to chant here in a little bit when we chant to the Heart Sutra. But that concept is originally a male form in Indian history, and as it moves in its synesthization, turns into a very feminine, almost Madonna-like form of East Asia. So I hope that's somewhat educational to you, but you see the basis of it is in the Lotus Sutra, and in how we practice today. We continue our practices around Avalokiteshvara and the messages that he taught to Shariputra in the Heart Sutra that we chant. So anyway, I leave that with you, and I hope that you see a little bit of how Zen and Buddhism are practiced in East Asia. So thank you.
And highly appropriate for the beginning of the International Women's Month. So back to the cushion.
Today was International Day of the Woman, right? So
I
March the
believe
8th.
so, yeah. Highly appropriate. So back to our 15-minute seated meditation period. chant the Heart Sutra. Mahaprajna Paramita Hridaya Sutra Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva, when practicing deeply the Prajna Paramita, perceives that all five skandhas are empty and is safe from all suffering and distress. Shariputra, form does not differ from emptiness. Emptiness does not differ from form. That which is form is emptiness. That which is emptiness, form. The same is true of feelings, perceptions, impulses, consciousness. Shariputra, all dharmas are marked with emptiness. They do not appear or disappear, are not tainted or pure, do not increase or decrease. Therefore in emptiness, no form, no feelings, perceptions, impulses, consciousness. No body, no mind, no color, no sound, no smell, no taste, no touch, no object of mind, no realm of minds, and so forth, till no realm of mind consciousness, no ignorance, and also no extinction of it, and so forth, until no old age and death, and also no extinction of them, no suffering, no origination, no stopping, no path, no cognition, also no attainment, with nothing to attain. The Bodhisattva depends on Prajna Paramita and attains Anuttara Samyak Bodhi. Therefore know that Prajna Paramita is the great transcendent mantra, is the great bright mantra, is the utmost mantra, is the supreme mantra, which is able to relieve all suffering and is true, not false. So proclaim the Prajna Paramita mantra. Proclaim the mantra which says Gate Gate Para Gate Parasamgate Bodhisvaha. Gate Gate Para Gate Parasamgate Bodhisvaha. Gate Gate Para Gate Parasamgate Bodhisvaha. So now is when we dedicate merit, and I will leave space for you to add in anyone you'd like to dedicate merit to as we go along. All sentient beings are one seamless body and pass quickly from birth to death. We remember those who cared for us and are gone, those who are ill, those who are at war, who are hungry and who are in pain. May they heal and have peace. We especially dedicate our service to Peyton, TJ, Mike Gingy Wood, Laura Haas Knox, Joanne and Bailey Sheridan, And would you like to add anyone in now?
My sister-in-law,
Megan.
my Lynn fam.
Any other?
Tortiga, a comrade who was killed by police, and all those still defending Wulani Forest, including the 30 who have been arrested over the weekend. No Cop City, Atlanta Forest, y'all. Thank you.
All beings in the 10 directions, subject to the greed, hatred, and delusions of themselves and others. All Buddhas throughout space and time, all honored ones, Bodhisattva, Mahasattvas, wisdom beyond wisdom, Mahaprajna Paramita. And since we're actually sitting on a night where it's pretty much a full moon, I get to share my screen now too. We're going to do our repentance ceremony. So let me share this. This moment I repent from the serious transgressions of taking any life, taking things not given, misconduct done in lust, false speech, taking intoxicants to produce heedlessness, discussing the faults of others, praising my own works, clinging and stinginess, wrathful anger, slandering the 3 jewels. May all offenses accumulated during hundreds of eons now be totally consumed in an instant, as fire burns dry grass, extinguishing all things until nothing remains. Our offenses have no self-nature, but arise only from our minds. If our minds are extinguished, then our offenses will be destroyed. When both our minds and our offenses are extinguished, and both are seen as empty, this is termed as true repentance. Hangdao, would you like to give us the gratitude gatha?
Infinite realms of light and dark convey the Buddha mind. Birds and trees and stars and we ourselves come forth in perfect harmony. We practice and recite this for all beings, and grateful thanks to our many guides along the way.
Our faith and practice vow. I will never retreat and will be firm in my mind in this correct Dharma. I will escape from the samsaric cycle of birth and death. I will definitely see my original face. I will be sure to inherit the life of insight of the Buddha and save all sentient beings. Life and death are of supreme importance. Time passes swiftly by, and opportunities to awaken are easily lost. Strive to realize your true nature, and do not squander your time by night or day.